Hello and welcome to the Physicians of Culture Philosophy podcast. My name's Glenn McLaren. I'm a philosopher at Swinburne University of Technology, Melbourne, Australia, and I'm here with my colleague and fellow philosopher, the eminent Arran Gare. Hi Arran, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good. In our last podcast, we looked at the name Physicians of Culture, how it came from the work of German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And we looked at the concept of culture more generally as a way of better understanding sort of the dynamics of what's going on in human civilizations and how we can best understand the sorts of crises that we're facing at the moment. We looked at the idea coming from Nietzsche that we can see our cultures are suffering from various ills or sicknesses, and that the role of philosophers should be to be able to diagnose those ills and be able to prescribe some remedies for them. Today we want to look at the question of what is philosophy more broadly. This is a question that comes up every year when I teach first year students. The first thing we usually do is ask the question of what is philosophy. And one of the first things I point out to them is that the word philosophy itself is really quite vague in its meaning. Of course, it's well known that the word means it is derived from the ancient Greek, meaning love of wisdom. But there's the problem straight away, isn't it? Because the word love has never been adequately defined through much of history, and the word wisdom is very difficult to define as well. So I've always thought it must really vex university managements when they're funding a group of people who are studying the love of wisdom, because it's so vague. They hate vagueness, don't they?
They do.
But that's what we do. Now, in talking about what is philosophy, I just want to tell a quick story about how I first, sort of the light bulb moment, I guess, of when I first understood what the role of a philosopher was in society and how important it was. And it came about when I was doing my PhD back in the early 2000s on the obesity crisis. And at the time I was deep into studying phenomenology. And I love phenomenology because I was a fitness instructor and I was right into all the embodied reasoning and embodied cognition, and anything embodied seemed pretty good to me as a fitness person. And I was studying people like Martin Heidegger and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and also the Japanese Kyoto school, who drew on their work quite heavily. And I went to a big conference on exercise and nutrition at Melbourne University to enlighten myself. And I found myself in a session being run by an exercise physiologist on what is the best preparation for doing a standing vertical jump. Now, you might not be familiar with this, Arran, but a standing vertical jump is actually quite important in the sporting world and in the professional sporting world in identifying talent. So young sportsmen, they put them through this thing where they have to stand there, squat down, and then jump as high as they can, and they measure how high they jump through a little device at the top. Obviously, the higher you can jump, the more attractive you are to, basketball coaches or football or volleyball coaches or whatever. Anyway, he said the two preparations this guy studied were, one was static stretching, which is familiar, like a yoga stretch, where you get into a particular position and you hold that position for like 20 seconds or so in a passive way. And the other preparation was putting a big heavy barbell on your neck and doing 3 big power squats. And I was very excited about this. And he said his conclusion was that the best preparation for doing a better standing vertical jump was to do 3 power squats with a heavy barbell. Now, immediately I related this to phenomenology. I was thinking, and I was also studying at the time things like anticipatory systems. I was thinking, this is all about a process of anticipating a world. Like, also with people like von Uxküll and the idea of having a world or an Umwelt. This is someone who is being able to anticipate doing something, by lifting heavy weights. They're anticipating lifting a heavy weight the next time. And then you take the weight away and suddenly they can jump a lot higher. It's a bit like that old gag where, you had a barbell and it had 200 pounds written on each end of it, or 200 kilograms perhaps written on each end of it, but the whole thing was actually made out of cardboard. So when the person, gets themselves all ready to go and they lift it, and as soon as they pick it up, they end up throwing it through the roof because they've prepared themselves to lift a massive weight. So this all made sense to me, particularly through having studied phenomenology. So I went up to this guy afterwards and I said, look, I think I can help explain or help you understand what was going on here through phenomenology and through, I'm studying philosophy and all this sort of stuff, and this is what I think is happening. And I'm talking and the guy's got this blank look on his face. And after I finish talking, he just looks at me and says, he says, yeah, well, I just leave that sort of speculation to you philosophers. He says, I just collect the data. And that's when the light bulb went off. That's when I recognized, okay, that's why I'm here. That's what I do. That's why I'm important. Because obviously we've got all of these people out there who are just collecting the data, but nobody knows what it means. And nobody's prepared to speculate more widely about what it might be, how it might be connected to a whole range of other things. So that's my sense of what I thought philosophy was about, what my job as a philosopher was, that sense of being able to make sense of things more broadly. So how do you see it, Arran?
Well, I suppose I have a different perspective. I suppose I could talk about how I became interested in philosophy. So as a student, I started off being a science student, studying physics and biology and chemistry and
collecting the data?
No, working with fairly abstract theories and mathematical models, but not really being able to interpret them. The emphasis was always on being able to make predictions. But underlying it was this very reductionist way of thinking, which seemed to me really problematic. Thinking about the values that I've been brought up with, they didn't support those values, they undermined them. So there was a contradiction.
Okay.
A contradiction between the values that I've been brought up with parents who I suppose were strongly influenced by the tradition of British idealism and the science I was being taught.
And what were these ideals?
The ideals of the British idealists were that life was about the individual should realise their full potential to contribute to their community. Australia was meant to be a strong democracy, and a condition of democracy's functioning properly is that people have a commitment to playing the role of citizens. So you had to uphold that, which is associated with the idea of people having responsibility for their actions, whereas the ideas we were taught in science made the whole notion of responsibility unintelligible. We were just chemical processes. There's no place for free will or responsibility.
Right.
So there's a basic contradiction there. Also, there were huge problems like the Vietnam War going on and problems of ascertaining what was really happening, what was the truth of the matter. And so I decided that I wanted to do something that was more socially oriented. So I switched to economics with a politics major within economics. Politics was all over the place, a whole lot of fragments. Economics was more coherent, but it seemed fishy to me, having studied science, and now appreciate what was going on. The economists were emulating the outward appearance of natural sciences without really understanding what real science is, or what the role of mathematics in science is. So I started questioning the assumptions of economics, but I was in a poor position to do it, as an undergraduate student, having to pass exams and so on. Yeah. Eventually I became something of a perpetual student and switched to philosophy, having to go back to the beginning. The other thing about that, though, was that I found that this was the area where we should be investigating the assumptions of the other disciplines, seeing how things are interrelated. Most philosophy was itself fragmented because Australian philosophy is dominated by analytic philosophy. So I had to really struggle to make my way in philosophy. I eventually got my honours degree and then went on to a PhD, but doing that at a new university, Murdoch University in Western Australia, which enabled me to take my own path. But that involved, initially I had a clash with my supervisor who just dismissed all the stuff that I'd defended. based on advances in the philosophy of science, I found I had to go back to basics again. What is science? What is knowledge? What is, you look at the assumptions underlying economic theory about what humans are. Well, what are humans, and how do you ascertain what are humans? It turns out, trying to make sense of all that, you can't do it unless you have an understanding of the history of how ideas develop. And eventually you have to go back and look at, the 17th century scientific revolution and what happened subsequent to that, but also you have to go back to what preceded that, ultimately to the ancient Greeks, and then trying to understand how philosophy emerged in ancient Greece and what differentiated ancient Greece from other cultures.
So your experience seems to mirror that of many of the other philosophers we admire, who have often started off in like science or mathematics.
That's right,
and
yes.
Then seen the limitations of that.
That's right, yeah. So all the major philosophers of the 20th century started off as mathematicians. And then you think of Husserl being a mathematician, Whitehead a mathematician, Russell a mathematician, C.S. Perth a mathematician.
Interesting, isn't it?
All the different schools of thought, all begun by mathematicians. And they were struggling to understand what mathematics was and what its relationship to science was, looking particularly at the nature of science. How do you justify science? The school that dominated the Anglophone world was really developing Russell's ideas, which I think was probably the worst choice. It was very narrow. It was associated with the idea that you can get absolute certainty if you focus on the most trivial aspects of reality. Your appreciation of sense data and the like.
People like Gilbert Ryle too, wasn't it?
Yeah, Gilbert Ryle. That was slightly different. That was associated with ordinary language philosophy, that giving up on the quest to understand the world or reasoning through symbolic logic. You say, okay, well, there's a wisdom embodied in our ordinary language. We just have to explicate that wisdom and then we're right. Well, that just ignored how our ordinary understanding of things clashed with the ideas being promulgated by the scientists who were claiming to have the true knowledge of the world. So you see all these contradictions in our culture, and you have to say, well, where do these come from? And then you start looking at history, and then you say, well, what is history? How is it that we're able to remember the past? Well, if you think about what I was doing, what differentiated me from most of the other people I was studying with, I kept on asking questions.
Too many questions, it sounded like.
It is, yeah. But when I started looking into it, I realized that this is really what distinguished the ancient Greek philosophers. They were asking questions all the time. And by virtue of that, they were making incredible intellectual achievements, laying the foundations for philosophy, for science, for mathematics, developing literature, drama, poetry. There's a fairly small number of people if you look at it. And so one of the most important things I realized is how important it is to ask questions. But asking questions, and people defended that, Robin Collingwood, but he was echoing people like Kant and Plato and so on. Plato's dialogues are all about asking questions.
Yeah.
So you say, well, is it just random asking questions? It isn't, because you ask questions realizing that those questions are always based on having assumptions. And usually it's associated with appreciating how those assumptions somehow don't make sense or clash with new experiences. Then you start looking at those assumptions and identifying them. And again, you realize that you can only properly identify those assumptions when you look at history and see where they were first embraced. When they were first embraced, it's a lot clearer why they were embraced and what they are. So that's the basis for being able to question these assumptions.
And is this what also led to the importance of metaphysics in your work?
Yeah, well, in reaction to analytic philosophy, which tries to break everything down into small units and fragments philosophy itself into a whole lot of sub-disciplines and sub-sub-disciplines. So you have ethics separated from political philosophy, separated from epistemology and so on. Then within ethics, you have environmental ethics and all these other things. So ultimately just reinforcing the fragmentation of the culture that I was reacting against. Now, coming across the person who was hostile to my thinking at Murdoch University, I realised, well, how do you start? And there are various ways of doing that. And some philosophers like Descartes say, well, we doubt everything and start from what we can't doubt. I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
Other people argued that, well, we start from sensory experience. We can't doubt, that we're experiencing the colour yellow or whatever, and that provides the foundation. It turns out, when you look at it, that those things didn't work. Supposing you think about Descartes doubting everything, well, how do you understand what a doubt is? It's only in a particular culture that you have a place for doubting. As McIntyre pointed out, to doubt everything is a recipe for a mental breakdown because you wouldn't be able to think.
Wouldn't operate at all, no.
Yeah.
Extreme scepticism.
And the thing is that you had all these people claiming that they had the foundations, whether it was the phenomenologists talking about apodictic knowledge through phenomenological reductions in the case of Husserl, Russell talking about atomic propositions that are true because they correspond to what you actually experience.
Yeah.
And there's no agreement on these things. It turns out when you look at experience, and I think the philosophers of science were the most fruitful in grappling with these problems, your experience is strongly influenced by your conceptual frameworks. You don't just passively experience the world. You're interpreting it all the time, and you're interpreting it usually associated with more questioning. So you try and get at the ultimate assumptions that you're making, and how do you defend these? Well, it turns out it's rather peculiar, but you have to start off somewhere, and you have to develop your thinking in such a way that your initial assumptions are defended by the system of thought you developed on those assumptions. But to just be not a random, circular argument, you have to engage with every other claim made in this direction. So this means that you have to incorporate the best of all other positions, somehow understanding them and interpreting them. So you're situated in the world in a particular culture, but you are able to reflect upon that culture, and to get your bearings, not to be just caught up in the current fashions. You have to have that holistic perspective. And that holistic perspective, that's what metaphysics is all about, why metaphysics is absolutely essential. And what you're looking at then when you're doing that is you engage with your own culture, you look at all the different beliefs in it, and you don't just accept anything. You try to work out what you can actually defend and what you need to develop. And you realize then that, as the philosophers of science have realized, that science itself is based on metaphysical assumptions, and that there are metaphysical revolutions, so major revolutions in science based on different metaphysical assumptions. So the 17th century scientific revolution wasn't, as Descartes claimed, doubting everything to find out what you could believe absolutely certain with absolute certainty. It was based on rejecting the previous way of understanding the world, the previous basic assumptions, which was Aristotelian worldview, in trying to make sense of things, because there are contradictions or blank points in Aristotle's understanding of the world that just couldn't be dealt with. He couldn't make proper sense of astronomy, and the development of astronomy actually broke out of the framework of the Aristotelian framework of concepts, and you needed a new metaphysics to make sense of the observations being made, redefining the whole nature of matter, space, time, in fact inventing the notion of space because it didn't exist in the ancient world, a new conceptual framework. And so you move on from one conceptual framework to another.
Which was happening in the development of science, but wasn't being acknowledged.
Yeah, that's right. So you realise then that there are rival research traditions within science based on different metaphysical commitments. And how do you judge between these? Well, it turns out that to do that, you have to develop your history of the development of those traditions, and looking at the major conflicts there are conflicts between different metaphysical positions. So your metaphysics has to be such that it acknowledges the reality of metaphysics and metaphysical traditions of thought, and you're engaging in trying to uphold and defend a particular metaphysical framework, among others, showing that it's superior by virtue of its capacity to make sense of the achievements of the rival traditions, but go beyond them. But going beyond them is difficult to judge what is really going beyond them, because you're often changing the meaning of terms. What is science? What is knowledge?
Yeah.
So you see it, in a sense. Neurath, who's a logical positivist, but much better than most of them, said that it's like having to repair a boat at sea where you're underway, but you have to repair it, including the keel.
Yeah, right.
And the keel is, in a sense, where, that's the metaphysics, the most difficult part to grapple with and repair.
Yeah. The thing that keeps you balanced.
That's right, yeah.
Now, I remember in nihilism, what you saying too, how looking at metaphysical traditions is easier in a sense because there's less possibilities.
That's right, yeah. You realise that there might be perhaps only 4 viable alternatives. The atomistic, mechanistic view of the world, the formism of the Platonists, contextual process philosophy, and absolute idealism. These are the main contenders. So on that basis, we'll be talking about this later on, I argued that process philosophy is the most defensible tradition. But within that, you'll have rival versions of it competing with each other, trying to show their superiority, or trying to integrate ideas from each other.
So you're really talking about how philosophers always go that extra step of going down further rabbit holes.
That's right.
I always remember the metaphysics of Peirce, the firstness, secondness, and thirdness, and how that idea of having that initial experience of something going to happen or whatever, and then the secondness of that thing happening, then the thirdness of then reflecting on what the hell happened.
Yeah.
And then, but also through that experience, then it's like when most people encounter something in the world that disturbs them or is a bit different or delights them or whatever, they'll usually move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And not worry, not think about it. Whatever. Whereas the philosopher takes, well, not too obsessively because you couldn't operate at all, but we often take that extra step of saying, well, why did I think that? Why did I have that emotional reaction? Or why did I think that? Why did I do that? And then trace that, and then you end up tracing that to the whole history of the universe.
That's right. Yeah. The other thing is that you realise that you're situated in the world. You've inherited a whole tradition of thought, a whole culture, with all its contradictions, and you have to take that as your starting point. You have to,
and that's often painful, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. But you realise then that your civilizations are based on metaphysical commitments. So modernity is mainstream modernity is a particular civilization based on a particular set of metaphysical commitments, and this is the culture that's come to dominate the world.
Yeah.
I became interested in what was going on with the environment, and seeing that this whole civilization and the metaphysical assumptions on which it's based are fundamentally flawed. It's facilitated its conquest of the world, killing about 100 million people in the process. And that's before the Second World War, the First and Second World Wars, which were really a continuation of the whole trajectory of that civilization. And it's flawed. So you realise that metaphysics isn't some airy-fairy thing. It's the most important area of inquiry.
Even understanding things like the dominance of sight, understanding the world, or the role of metaphors, for instance.
Yeah, that's right. Well, grappling with it, you realise that all our thinking, as Nietzsche recognised, is based on metaphors and metonyms.
Yeah.
And Lakoff and Johnson wrote a book, The Metaphors We Live By, just showing
that book. Yeah.
All our everyday language is just permeated with metaphors. And some of these metaphors are fundamentally defective, but unless you recognise that they are metaphors, you don't recognise that they can be challenged and better metaphors can be elaborated. There's a problem about what's involved in elaboration of metaphors. The whole problem of how you think in metaphors. So looking at how Swinburne philosophy differed from analytic philosophy, for instance, analytic philosophy privileged initially symbolic logic. So they thought that through this you get certain knowledge, along with experience being the foundations for knowledge. And they focused on analysis of arguments, and they claimed in this way we get certainty.
Yeah.
Starting off with the most trivial things and then building up from there. This view was, I think, fundamentally flawed. You can't gain knowledge that way. You're ignoring too much. And C.D. Broad, who was a philosopher writing when analytic philosophy was emerging, pointed out there are different ways of thinking that philosophers utilize, and you have to use all of them. One is analysis. So it's not to say analysis should be rejected. It's only one part of thinking philosophically.
Yeah.
Then a second, and I think that he was really important to have recognised this, is synopses. Synopses, when you look at the etymology of the word, means seeing together. So philosophers are people who don't just look at discourses in isolation, they relate them to each other. So getting back to appreciating that my ideas that I was being taught in science contradicted the idea of people being responsible for their action, that's a kind of synopsis.
And that's
Viewing
that holistic approach.
Yeah. Yeah. But also, if you think about it, synopsis is what you do in history. You view together different traditions of thought, different ideas, and relate them to each other. So it's essential to the kind of dialogue that is associated with thinking. The third thing is synthetic thought. Analysis is defined in opposition to synthetic thinking, which is the most creative part of philosophy. When you develop new ways of thinking, you develop new metaphors, and it's important to recognize there's a lot of metaphors in that.
Yeah.
Like the mechanical view of the world replaced the organic analogy that dominated Aristotelian physics.
So Broad has appeared in your work quite a lot, and one of the other most important papers I think you wrote, which I use quite a lot, is your paper on where you contrast both Whitehead and Bertrand Russell and their ways of thought. Where you're looking at the idea of speculative metaphysics, for instance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
as opposed to what Russell was doing.
Yeah. So Russell was saying that we accumulate knowledge through science, and philosophy comes in where you have to at the cutting edge of science, where you have to do a bit of speculation. So it was giving some place to speculation, but he thought of knowledge as cumulative. The difference between him and Whitehead was saying that all our claims to knowledge are based on metaphysical assumptions that are questionable. And so you never get a simple accumulation of knowledge. And this is paving the way for the possibility of radical revolutions in thinking and science, the sort of thing that Thomas Kuhn talked about as revolutionary science. So Russell didn't have a place for revolutionary science, whereas Whitehead did. And I think Whitehead, as I argue, was right. Now that speculation is, when you look at it, it's associated with imagination, the ability to play with ideas, the sort of thing that managers of university try to eliminate.
That's right, because that's one of the most important things that I teach based on that, is that the most important quality that philosophers have, I think, is the power of imagination.
That's right. Yeah. And it's not just philosophers. If you think about the main originators of the philosophical doctrines of the 20th century, being mathematicians, when you start looking at mathematicians, you realize the most important part of mathematics isn't rigid logic. It's actually having the imagination to develop whole new branches of mathematics. And this is true of Descartes as well as anyone else, developed analytic geometry.
And model all of those different shapes in your head. And that's right. Yeah.
And you have to have that capacity to, cultivate a kind of interior space where you play with ideas and imagine new possibilities. And you,
I've tried to tell people at Swinburne Management, for instance, that universities are actually huge playgrounds.
They should be, yeah.
That's what they're supposed to be. They're not supposed to be places where everyone is controlled and particular research is favoured over others.
Yeah.
Is the place where you should be encouraged to play with ideas.
Yeah.
But whether the taxpayer is prepared to fund that or not, that seems to be the problem.
Nietzsche talked about philosophers playing. He said that they have to play with the seriousness of young children playing games. And that's the thing, that we tend to divide everything up as though you play in your off times, and when you're serious, you don't play. But in fact, the most creative stuff, which is the most serious stuff, is actually playing in this environment. Now, it's interesting looking at what's involved in that, because one of the interesting things about evolution is the phenomenon of neoteny.
Oh,
This is where adults instead of maturing, the young characteristics are continued. So you look at humans and you can see that they've got the physiognomy of young chimpanzees or whatever. They haven't fully matured. Now, people have taken this further and said that you look at animals and they're actually immature plants. So, really, really primitive plants, sort of, before they've grown up.
Is that what you
like
call
animals.
Vegetative semiosis? Or
Yeah, well, it is to some extent. But it's, in the case of universities, you preserve that openness, that curiosity of young children, but you do it in a kind of disciplined way.
Yeah.
But you have to have that. And to people who sort of become more mechanical as they've got older, who don't have any place for play, well, it's anathema to them. But in fact, this is why universities are so important to civilization.
Because, well, Johann Heisinger argued, didn't he, that if you stop playing, if a civilization stops playing with ideas, for instance, then it's on its way out.
It is, yeah. And this is why we're on the way out, because
we've
got all these managers who are eliminating any place for playing.
Any possibility for creating potential, basically.
Yeah, but it's interesting looking at, tutorials or seminars that work in universities, because you've got that disciplined imagination, and there are a lot of students who don't want to go along with that. It does require the discipline, doing your reading and so on. But then that openness to rethinking things, and it's you're cultivating a little local culture in which you're fostering that capacity to play with ideas. It's difficult to achieve, but it is one of the most important things that students are going to get out of a university education.
Yeah, well, this is their opportunity, isn't it? And so how does this then lend itself to speculative naturalism? Because we ran a whole conference on this, I remember, at one stage.
That's right, yeah. So what you had with the development of European civilization was, first of all, you had really speculative thinking bringing about the scientific revolution of the 17th century. But then they wanted to do away with that speculative thinking. They thought that we've got the truth now. This is what Descartes claimed. We've doubted everything, and we've founding our knowledge on absolute certainty.
Took out the bad apples and put back the good ones.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we don't need any more speculation. The people who rejected that, the romantics and then the idealists, they gave a place to speculation. But they tended to, particularly in the case of the idealists, not give all that much place to the natural sciences. They tended to be really strong in the humanities and talking about the value of literature and the like, but they weren't properly engaging with the natural sciences, and they separated humans from the rest of nature. So what they were doing was opting for one side of that Cartesian dualism, the mind as opposed to matter. So Schelling just rejected that dualism, and
Friedrich Schelling,
and argued that what we need is speculation, but still embracing naturalism. And that involves actually challenging mainstream science.
Right.
So this is what I was defending, to overcome that schism in our culture between, the humanities and the natural sciences, between the subjective and the objective. We need a conception of nature that gives a place to subjects, to human culture. This is where biosemiotics comes in, because it's associated with understanding life forms, other life forms, so that you can understand how humans can have developed within nature, developing that capacity for semiosis in new directions, which leads to us being cultural beings.
And an openness.
Yeah.
an open-endedness to us. Open-endedness to
But
it.
you realise then that our cultures are part of nature.
Yeah.
And if you situate ourselves as part of nature and you say, okay, well, we've got a defective culture, we've become like a cancerous growth in the global ecosystem. And
Because
getting back to, philosophers as physicians of culture, it's actually trying to heal not only our culture, it's healing our humanity and healing nature,
and
trying
strengthening our immune system in a sense.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Developing a kind of culture where we augment rather than undermine the resilience of the global ecosystem, where we augment life.
Now that naturalism was, as he said, came from Schelling in many ways, doesn't it, in his response to Hegel's idealism?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's had a huge influence on the natural sciences, but the natural sciences have insulated themselves from the implications of that by redefining knowledge as just means to make predictions.
Yeah.
So the revolutions like the development of the concept of energy, the concept of force fields, all those things that now have replaced the idea of inert matter in motion are not properly acknowledged for what they are, revolutions in science that actually help pave the way for changing our understanding of what life is and then what humans are, and aligning the natural sciences with the humanities as they've been defended. The humanities is also worth looking at. The humanities were developed in Renaissance Italy, and they were an effort to revive ideas from the Roman Republic and from ancient Greece. So it's rebirth. And to begin with, they focused on history, rhetoric, and so on, law. They didn't look at the natural sciences. But that
They included mathematics, didn't they?
I don't think they gave much place to mathematics.
No.
It was only later on the more radical versions of it by people like Giordano Bruno that started bringing in mathematics. So these people were developing ideas that have had a big influence on modernity, but in opposition to the dominant scientific reductionism. So now we've got a problem of a culture that's sort of bifurcated, but the humanities, despite the fact of the revolution in science that should align the sciences with the humanities are being eliminated.
So that separation of the humanities and sciences really gets us back to that exercise physiologist I was talking about at the start. So if you think about philosophy once again being the love of wisdom, in Aristotle's understanding, wisdom or Sophia and episteme were both related to each other, as was scientia and sapientia in the Roman understanding. And the idea was, you have all of these different sciences. The sciences really are ways in which you go out and you gather knowledge of the world. So you have the different logi words, for instance, like biology is the study of life, geology is the study of the earth, etc. And the idea is that you gather this knowledge about the world in order to inform wisdom.
That's right.
Yeah. And so we've sort of turned that around in some sort of perverse way, whereas we just go out and gather knowledge about the world without any really clear idea of why we're doing it, which is the sort of sense that I got.
That's right.
And that's where the humanities helps you to work out why it is you're gaining knowledge about the world in the first place.
That's right, yeah. The humanities, because initially they turned their backs on the natural sciences, lent themselves to being isolated. But the work of the radical Renaissance thinkers like Giordano Bruno, which did involve developing the natural sciences, and then the development of German Romanticism, where you actually tried to revolutionize science to align it with the humanities, which took place in the Humboldtian model of the university, was trying to sort of unify our culture, providing a coherent perspective on everything. And so science did contribute to wisdom. Now you've got this fragmentation, and the thing is that a lot of the philosophers, like the analytic philosophers, actually legitimated that fragmentation and after specialization. And they've, even though they've been refuted within philosophy, they've influenced the way universities are organized.
And so many of them became famous despite not questioning their assumptions.
That's right, yeah. Mm.
So
And
let's...
Russell
Yeah.
was nowhere near the worst in that
No.
regard, because in some of his writings he was questioning his assumptions.
At least he acknowledged some complexity as well.
That's right. But
Yeah.
his epigoni, the followers who just wanted academic positions and comfortable life, they trivialized philosophy and paved the way for its elimination.
Yeah, that's
as,
right.
As did the people in humanities generally. Tacitly, I mean, they claimed to be supporting literature, but tacitly they were accepting that they were just playing with ideas, playing with words. It's science that was making the real contributions, developing technology that gave them the time to waffle on about literature.
Yeah, a big complaint of yours has long been that academics have been their own worst enemies in this regard, in undermining the whole field.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this is why George Orwell in 1984 is so important, because he recognised how words start developing the opposite meaning to what they are. So you found that the Ministry of Love is where people are taken to be tortured and then vaporised. It might seem a bit odd to...
A bit like a modern university being an educational institution, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you go to become an idiot.
Yeah. And create this learned ignorance.
So near the end of our podcast now, but let's talk about the fact that you're one of the world's leading process philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
And how did all of this, like one of the things that certainly helped me in understanding the obesity crisis, for instance, was understanding the ways people had become so fixed in their understanding of themselves. There seems to be a propensity amongst human beings to freeze moments in time and wanting to hang on to those moments in time.
Yeah.
So the idea of process really was attractive to me. So how did you become a process thinker? Where did that start from, you think?
I think it was grappling with the problem of how it's possible for consciousness to emerge within nature.
Right.
So you think about consciousness, it's not a thing, it's not an object. If you think about it, there's a correlation between subjects and objects. Subjective consciousness is a process. And if nature has given rise to consciousness, nature itself must be fundamentally process. And when you start looking at that, you can find that you can actually interpret developments in physics and the like, and in fact make them more intelligible by recognizing that what we're facing in grappling with our understanding of nature is that nature is essentially process. Not many people are doing that, but if you think about how Einstein talked about space-time, Milik Čapek, who was a process philosopher, said we should be talking about time-space. Time is more fundamental. And it turns out that this is what Schelling himself had argued, that we should take temporality as more important than spatiality. Spatiality is the potential for independence and then interaction, which can only be understood through temporality. Later on, David Bohm wrote Special Relativity, in which he embraced that idea that we should be talking about time-space rather than space-time. Once you do that, and then you start looking at the what we experience, the existence of atoms, molecules, and so on, and you say, well, these are actually processes, and when we measure things, we objectify them, but that's not grappling with them as they are. You have to approach these indirectly, and it's recognizing that you're freezing what are essentially processes. You're measuring things, but it's the process that's the fundamental reality.
And this goes right back to the dialectic between Heraclitus and Parmenides, doesn't it? And
it does, yeah.
And then it's the impact on Plato's work.
Yeah, and you can see that Parmenides had a huge influence, and it was he was influenced by the Pythagoreans. Mathematics seems to grasp reality timelessly. 2 + 2 always equals 4, that kind of thing. And if you say that the world is fundamentally mathematical, it implies that, perhaps fundamentally reality is just timeless. And this is what Parmenides concluded, but he also concluded on that basis that the way of truth didn't acknowledge any differentiation in the world. It's just one big plenum, which is pretty bizarre. So our way of belief acknowledges change, the diversity in the world, but it's an illusion that fundamentally there's only this being. Well, this was Heraclitus sort of reacted against that, but Heraclitus was really supporting Anaximander. And Anaximander had argued that the world is essentially boundless or unlimited,
a Pyrrhon,
and then it gets limited.
Yes, which brings us back to Schelling, yeah.
Yeah, so this is an evolutionary cosmology in which, through the limiting of the unlimited, you actually get matter, life, humans, and so on. We can talk about that later, but it's a paradoxical kind of idea that creative evolution involves limiting, and the idea that there are such things as facilitative constraints or facilitative limits that actually pave the way for new forms of creativity.
Yeah, I've never been able to understand how, with sort of determinism, how you can get anything different than what there is.
Yeah, well, you can't. And this is Peirce pointed this out. We've got variety in the world, but if you're starting off with mathematics and what there is, how can there be this variety? Well, it can't be. Somehow there's something wrong with our basic understanding of the world.
Well, I think we've covered a lot today. Hopefully we've given people a sense of what it is we're doing, what we've been doing at Swinburne, in terms of mainly based around your work, of course. It may not sound radical to a lot of people, going down this path of recognising time and recognising change and process, etc., and the reality of becoming as being more sort of primordial than being, being more a sense, a form of abstraction. But also, I hope we've pointed out the sorts of resistance that we have to these ways of thinking.
That's right.
And the success that so many philosophers have had over hundreds and thousands of years in taking the opposite view, taking that sort of that highly abstract view, which perhaps we'll talk about in future podcasts about the nature of abstraction in particular.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
All right, well, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you in the next Physicians of Culture Philosophy podcast. Bye from me, bye from you.